From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Charles Lister, the director of MEI's Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs. Today, we're going to be talking about the state of Al-Qaeda in Yemen and its place in Yemen's persistent internal conflict. Once labelled the leading threat of global terror attacks, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, has melted into Yemen's complex conflict arena, fighting the Saudi-led coalition, the Houthis, and ISIS, amongst others in recent years. In 2015, AQAP was capturing cities like Mukalla and turning its attention to proto-governance, but 6 years later it looks to be sustaining a far less consequential existence, with operations in less than half of the districts it had been active in before. To talk about all of this, I'm thrilled to be joined by two fantastic guests. First, we have Elisabeth Kendall, a senior research fellow in Arabic and Islamic studies at Pembroke College at Oxford University. In addition to being perhaps one of the world's only experts in jihadist use of poetry, Liz's work focuses on Yemen, and particularly on how militant jihadist movements exploit and feed off traditional Arab cultures. Liz has previously held posts at the universities of Edinburgh, Oxford, and Harvard, and has spent substantial time in the field, especially in Yemen. And she's also dedicated pro bono time to a cross-tribal initiative in eastern Yemen, aimed at promoting social and political cohesion as a counterweight to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Next up, and alongside Liz, I'm equally excited to be joined by Nadwa al-Dawsari, who is currently a non-resident fellow at MEI, and before that was Yemen Country Director for the Centre of Civilians in Conflict, a senior non-resident fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy, and a founding director of Partners Yemen, a local affiliate centre of Partners Global. Earlier in her career, Nadwa worked as a senior program manager at the National Democratic Institute in Yemen, managing elections monitoring and tribal conflict programs. Liz, Nadwa, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Let's jump straight into things. And first off, let me turn to you, Liz. You recently said something on Twitter, I believe, that attracted a lot of attention. You said something along the lines of that the term AQAP is losing meaning, or perhaps has lost meaning. And you attributed 5 different categories of people associated, both rightly and wrongly, with the label. I think they were fake, former, pragmatic, committed, and active. Can you perhaps expand a bit on what you meant there?
Yes, thank you for asking that incredibly important question, because the Al-Qaeda label, with regard to Yemen at least, has become really fast and loose, and it covers a whole bunch of overlapping categories, some of which really have very little to do with Al-Qaeda. So just to clarify, it doesn't mean that there are all these different groups, those 5 categories you've mentioned. It just signals that when we bandy the Al-Qaeda label about, we have to be aware that it covers lots of different types of things. So the first you mentioned, fake, that really refers to either mercenaries who are claiming false links to Al-Qaeda, that inflates their price, makes them perhaps more desirable to hire as gangs, or just ordinary military forces whose acts are deliberately false flag to Al-Qaeda, because that covers for political motives. Former militants are those who've genuinely lost interest in jihad and perhaps now just work for a political cause or money. Pragmatic, the third category, these are militants who've decided to adapt to prevailing conditions, and they're fighting under a new banner. But it doesn't mean that the jihadi ideology is completely dead inside them. Then there's the committed group. You could perhaps also call that concealed. These are militants who are still committed to jihad, but say that they're fighting under a new banner. They're just suppressing their identity, and, they could always make a comeback. And then lastly, there's this active group. They're the real deal. For them, it's business as usual. They're operating as themselves. They're operating as mujahideen, as jihadis, but they might also forge alliances of convenience with other conflict parties. I'm just going to add one further thought, which is that there is another category which I would call maybe spurious, and these are just wrongly assumed to be jihadis on the basis of their family or tribal ties. And I know that Nadwa has been at pains to point out how common this is in the Yemeni context.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And on that note, I was going to turn straight to Nadwa and get some of your thoughts on what Liz has just said, particularly perhaps on the tribal element, but also, as it pertains to the broader conflict in Yemen.
Yes. Al-Qaeda in Yemen has always been controversial from the perspective of Yemenis. Al-Qaeda is not a straightforward jihadist organization like a lot of people perceive. Yes, there is that element, but since the 90s, 2000s, Al-Qaeda has been used by political actors, sometimes manufactured by political actors as a decoy to either maintain Western support, the case of Saleh and elements in his regime, but mainly Saleh, but also to gain legitimacy. And it's the case of the Houthis. There has been reports of Houthis cooperating with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Houthis are not unique in that. Other political actors in Yemen have done that. And so this element of political actors using Al-Qaeda, working with Al-Qaeda, overlapping with Al-Qaeda has been absent in most of the analyses. And I appreciate Liz bringing this up, and it's true. If we want to look at Al-Qaeda in Yemen, we can't just look at the ideological factor or the ideological component, which does exist, but a lot of Al-Qaeda in Yemen is also related to political bargaining, how political actors conduct themselves. Using Al-Qaeda can help them, again, gain legitimacy, support, but also undermine their opponents. So, for example, the Houthis have framed their fight in Yemen as a fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, when it's actually not. They're expanding to take control of the country. And again, Houthis are not unique in that.
So I think that's fascinating. So clearly, from what you're both saying, AQAP is sort of intrinsically linked, dependent upon, respondent to all of the other dynamics that are ongoing in Yemen. And I suppose, first of all, of course, that's not a surprise, but the way in which it is revealing itself is clearly of interest. So let me sort of come back to both of you and say, given all of that, where is AQAP today? I noted at the beginning of the podcast that operationally they seem to have declined quite significantly over the last few years. But given where the conflict in Yemen is, where is AQAP and where do you think they're headed in the near future? Why don't we start with Liz again and then we'll go to Nadwa?
Yes, where is AQAP now? As you say, operationally, they are actually very weak. We've got about 1 in 10 the rate of operations that we had from them when they were at their guerrilla peak in 2017. And actually, we talk about them a lot, but in the context of Yemen's broader conflict, they're actually not that important. It's just something that we in the West are particularly focused on, because I guess these are also the people who are ideologically trying to convince Muslims in our own countries to kill us. So we tend to focus on them a bit more than perhaps Yemenis themselves these days do. They have been very strong in the past, but infighting and counterterrorism operations have made them fragment. And you think about it, pressures from drone strikes as your colleagues get picked off one after the other fuel these suspicions, which just are left to fester because their communications have been significantly impaired owing to the need to keep themselves safe from drone strikes. So they can't sort out their problems. And what that means is that their survival relies a bit more on alliances than perhaps it did in the past. Although just right here, I would just like to draw attention to 2 incredibly important points that Nadwa made, which is that there has been a very long history of the exploitation of jihadi groups in Yemen by political actors. It just feels like it's become pretty rampant in the last couple of years. It's certainly not a new thing. And the second point that Nadwa made that's really important is that it's not unique to any one political party. You can't draw straight lines. And to a greater or lesser extent, there are several political actors who are guilty of this in Yemen.
Indeed, so it sounds like. So Nadwa, before I get your thoughts on that same question, let me tack a sort of secondary question in there, which is to sort of bring into the discussion AQAP's current leader, Khalid Batafi, who, at least as I understand it, as a non-Yemen expert, at least part of the reason why he seemed to be promoted was because of his sort of deep tribal ties in the south. given what Liz has said about AQAP being in not the best of places right now, but also given the broader context in Yemen, has his position as leader made any difference in that regard, or are there sort of more challenges still than advantages?
I want to add to what Liz says in terms of the future of Al-Qaeda. In the past, for Yemenis, as Liz mentioned, Al-Qaeda was not really a problem for Yemenis, not in the scheme of the challenges that Yemenis face. And this was true even before the war and during the war. Because a lot of Yemenis saw Al-Qaeda as just one tool in the hands of political actors that are corrupt. And compared to other countries, Al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen has not been that strong and normally short-lived in terms of occupying areas and ruling areas and forcing their law on people. But what's happening now during this war is that there is an environment evolving that's perfect for jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda included. So the war has been going on for 7 years. It has become, in my opinion, a war of attrition. There is a military balance. There is fighting to what it seems no end. And with the war, what's happening is that there is a lot of pressure on social fabric. And I want to mention the tribes as one important element or the key element of Yemen's social fabric. And I've talked about this before. The tribes have, in fact, greatly limited the activities of jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda included, in Yemen. But the tribes have been busy fighting, and the fighting is putting a lot of pressure on the tribal system and the tribal cohesion. And if it continues, it will only be a matter of time before the tribal structure collapses. And if the tribal structure collapses, there would be massive insecurity and massive vacuum because the tribes are the main provider of security in Yemen. So in that vacuum, Al-Qaeda can operate and expand. The other important factor is that there is increasing sectarian identities and massive sectarian indoctrination, particularly in the north, under Houthi-controlled areas. And that is instigating counter-sectarian narrative. It's not as strong yet, but I think over time, it can become a real problem. The sectarian identities and sectarian conflict, and that will make the environment even more, conductive to terrorist groups' expansion. And in terms of Baatarafi, I cannot speak for Baatarafi, but I can speak about the tribes from my research and working with the tribes. So the tribes, as tribes, they don't really offer support for Al-Qaeda. There has been some tactical, if you will, looking the other way, because Al-Qaeda is fighting a common enemy. In this case, Al-Qaeda is fighting with the Houthis. And so the tribes, why would they fight Al-Qaeda if Al-Qaeda is helping them get rid of the Houthis? Again, I cannot speak about Baatarafi, but I can speak about somebody else that I know, say Tariq al-Dahab in Al-Bayda. Tariq al-Dahab was a local tribesman, come from a reputable family. He gained a lot of support among his tribesmen, not because of his ideology, not because of Al-Qaeda, but because he helped resolve a lot of local conflicts. I'm not sure, the case of Baatarafi and what he offers. I think Liz can speak, much better than me on about Baatarafi.
Great, fantastic. I think, in that sense, I'll turn to Liz. And Liz, by all means, expand on some of what Nadwa has said, including on Baatarafi. But, a sort of linked question here to kind of broaden out the discussion a bit would be to look at where Al-Qaeda globally, or at least in terms of its central leadership, what do you think Al-Qaeda is thinking right now when it looks at Yemen? I mean, clearly in the past, it has invested significantly and also benefited significantly from AQAP's previous status of significance. I mean, does Yemen still hold as much importance, in your opinion, to AQ as it has in the past? Have things changed? And of course, given what's happened in Afghanistan over the last few weeks, perhaps that's all in flux right now. But I'd be interested in your opinion on all of that.
Well, that's a broad set of questions. I think that Yemen remains symbolically significant to Al-Qaeda Central. But because Yemen is now overrun with different warring factions and actors that have latched onto different Al-Qaeda splinters and fragments. It's very difficult to get a grip on a sort of central Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that one can deal with and grow and use for training purposes and then spread out. You know, we've got the Saudis in the east of the country, the Emirati-backed forces in the south of the country, the Iran-linked forces in the north of the country to a greater or lesser extent. So it's no longer the Yemen that's quite the wild ground that Al-Qaeda could expand and exploit as it was. And perhaps that might now go back to Afghanistan. Who knows? Certainly, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been excited by the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. They've referred to our brothers in the Taliban. They've congratulated them specifically by name. And there have actually been quite a few poems and nasheeds about the Taliban, all very excited, looking forward to it. And don't forget, just to bring it back to Khalid Batarfi, the current leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, he trained in Afghanistan 20 years ago. And that's where he cut his teeth on the jihad in the first place before he landed in Yemen in 2002. As for Batarfi's popularity or suitability, is he going to make an impact? Actually, he's been quite a controversial figure since he was appointed in February last year after the previous leader, Qasim Aremi, was killed in the US strike. You know, he's inherited these splits. There's been a lot of tension over Al-Qaeda executions of some quite well-respected members, ideologues, sheikhs, on dubious spying charges, and Batarfi has not managed to sort that out. But, you know, just a final thought, you know, there aren't that many eminent leaders left. There've been so many killed in drone strikes. And although it's always easy to find someone to step into the shoes of droned colleagues, it's not always easy to find high caliber figures who are experienced, and certainly not very many veterans of the Afghan jihad left. So maybe that will change.
That's really interesting. Nadwa, did you have something to say?
Yeah, the Taliban retaking Afghanistan has revived hopes among terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda included. After 20 years and billions of, almost $1 trillion, not only the US was defeated, but the Mujahideen won. That's God's promise to the Mujahideen. And so it's a huge moral boost to Al-Qaeda. And I understand that the group is fragmented. I agree with Liz that the group has fragmented and it's less visible now given the war in Yemen. But I think this is a group that has evolved in the past and will probably continue to evolve in the future. So I wouldn't be surprised. And again, it depends on how this conflict goes. And it doesn't look promising for Yemen. It looks like the conflict will go on for the foreseeable future. And that will probably impact the security situation in a more profound way. Right now, Yemen is at war and there's fighting, but the country is relatively safe. When you travel across Yemen, it's relatively safe. The crime level is pretty low. And I'm talking about regular, ordinary crime. And that's because the social structures, mainly the tribes, maintain order, maintain security, including on the highway, limit the expansion of Al-Qaeda. I don't know if you know that, but even in 2016, when Al-Qaeda was pushed out from key cities in Yemen, including Mukalla and Hadramaut and in Abiyan as well, it was pushed out through tribal mediation. But if the security collapse, if the tribes collapse, and I say, I think it's only a matter of time if the situation continues like this, then you will have this massive security vacuum, and that will offer a really great opportunity for Al-Qaeda to reinvent itself and, reemerge. In what form? I don't know. I think Yemen might offer Al-Qaeda pretty good grounds in the future if the war continues. Or if the war continues, or if a quote-unquote solution to the war was forced upon Yemenis, where, say in this case, a political solution, if forced on Yemenis under the current circumstances, it will be to the benefit of the Houthis at the expense of the other groups and Yemenis as well. And that will exacerbate the current grievances, and that will offer a great opportunity to recruit.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I was kind of curious about the kind of opposite scenario, whereas there's all the push from the international community is to resolve, quote unquote, Yemen's conflict, or at the very least to negotiate more of a permanent ceasefire. And I was interested in how that would benefit or disadvantage AQAP, but I think you just implied an answer to that question. So let me quickly come to Liz before we run out of time with a kind of more CT focused question, which is, like I said in the beginning, in the introduction, AQAP was so well known in the West as posing such a significant external terrorism threat or a global terrorism threat. That seems to really have dropped off the radar right now. Has it genuinely dropped off the radar? Is there prospects for that changing sometime soon? And if so, how?
I think it's important to be very cautious before we decide that AQAP has dropped off the radar as a threat, because we've been here so many times before where it looks like job done, they're defeated or so badly impaired that they're now not a threat, and yet they come back again. So it's that age-old situation where you kill people but you don't kill ideas, and once they're there they can revive themselves. So I think it is still a threat. And one of the points that Nadwa made that I very strongly agree with is that if there is no buy-in for an internationally negotiated peace on the ground, if people do not feel adequately represented, if they don't feel that the peace reflects what they want, then the peace will never take off. And when that happens, or if that happens, then that's an opportunity for Al-Qaeda. And particularly if the country falls apart, if it fragments further, if the South breaks into different warring factions, or the South breaks from the North, I think these are dangerous times. And Al-Qaeda will exploit that kind of security vacuum. In terms of what that means for us in the West, apart from the moral issue of not wanting Yemen to disintegrate, which I hope is a given, there is still a threat of wanting to lash out against elements in the West and their Arab leader allies whom they consider responsible for having propped up corrupt regimes in their areas for decades. So even if they're not in a position at the moment to launch attacks in the West, they can still direct them, they can still inspire them. We saw that with the Pensacola shooting in 2019. And I'd be particularly worried about perhaps maritime attacks. I think particularly with partners on the ground, that Al-Qaeda could see this as a way of attacking the West in a more practical vein off its own coastline. So lots of reasons still to be worried.
Excellent. Always glad to end on a worrying note. Liz, Nadwa, I think we could carry on this conversation for a long time, but unfortunately we are out of time, more or less. So first off, thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to join Middle East Focus. Thank you also to MEI's audience for listening in. I do hope you'll continue to listen to the podcast and keep your eyes out for plenty more interesting material coming from the Countering Terrorism and Extremism program. But in the meantime, thank you again to all of you, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.